You know that feeling when you are just profoundly exhausted? I mean, I'm not talking about the kind of physical fatigue you get after running a marathon or something.
Right, or just that normal Friday evening tiredness after the office.
Exactly, yeah. I am talking about a highly specific, like bone-deep exhaustion that comes from spending years or maybe even decades doing everything just slightly wrong. And
Yes.
the kicker is, it is absolutely not from a lack of effort. You are trying so incredibly hard. But it just feels like the brain doing the work was, well, never quite understood by the world around it.
It is an invisible friction. I mean, you are moving through the exact same physical space as everyone else, but there is this constant, unexplained physiological drag on your energy, a drag that other people simply do not have to contend with.
And that invisible drag is really the perfect jumping off point for today's deep dive. We are exploring the phenomenon of the late diagnosed mind. So specifically, we are diving into this fascinating article from Psychology Today by Dr. Darren O'Reilly. It's called The Late Diagnosed Mind. And the mission today is to figure out why so many adults, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, are just suddenly discovering they have ADHD or autism.
Is huge shift.
It really is. We are going to unpack the massive psychological toll of flying under the radar for that long and look at what actually changes when a diagnosis finally arrives. I think the best way to visualize this undiagnosed experience is to imagine trying to run this beautifully designed, high-performance video editing software on an entirely incompatible operating system.
Oh, like one built for basic spreadsheets?
Exactly. The software itself isn't broken at all, but because of that fundamental mismatch, the computer's internal fan is just screaming at maximum volume just to keep background processes running. The battery drains in an hour, and, the user manual everyone else is reading makes absolutely no sense to you.
That operating system analogy really hits on the core mechanical failure of the undiagnosed experience. And we really need to establish the sheer scale of this right up front.
Yeah.
Because we aren't just talking about a trendy topic or a quirky internet fad. There is a massive documented demographic shift happening in global healthcare right now.
Okay, so the scale really is staggering. Let's put some parameters around that shift. Just how big of a wave are we talking about here?
Well, between 2011 and 2022, autism diagnosis rates in large U.S. health systems skyrocketed by 175%.
Wow, 175%.
Yes, and we're seeing comparable, just massive jumps for adult ADHD across the entire English-speaking world. But the crucial context here, and I really want to emphasize this, is that these aren't new conditions just spontaneously appearing.
Right. It's not something in the water supply.
Exactly. These are not new people. These are individuals who are always there, sitting in our classrooms and working in our offices. But they were entirely missed by the clinical and educational systems when they were children.
Which is wild to think about. How do millions of people just slip through the cracks like that? I mean, how do you make it to 45 years old, build a career, start a family, without a single doctor or teacher realizing your brain operates on a fundamentally different neurodevelopmental track?
It all comes down to a survival mechanism that most of our listeners are probably familiar with on a surface level, which is masking.
Masking, right.
But we need to look past the basic definition of masking as just like a social chameleon act. We have to look at the physiological reality. In the context of autism and ADHD, masking is the manual, conscious override of your autonomic nervous system.
So it's not just, deciding to smile more at a party.
Far from it. It is studying how neurotypical people interact and manually replicating it constantly.
Jeez.
It's calculating the exact socially acceptable duration of eye contact, even when that eye contact causes actual physical discomfort, or suppressing the natural urge to physically regulate your nervous system through movement because it might look unprofessional.
So you are basically constantly translating your natural way of being into a language the rest of the world demands.
Precisely. The prefrontal cortex is essentially working overtime to manage behaviors that, for a neurotypical person, just happen completely automatically.
That manual override sounds like it requires just a massive amount of processing power. And there is a fascinating demographic reality to who ends up possessing that processing power to mask successfully.
Yes, there is a massive gender gap here.
Right.
Autistic females are diagnosed much later than their male counterparts. The vast majority of them don't receive a diagnosis until adulthood. They tend to present with more internalizing behaviors like anxiety or intense perfectionism, rather than the disruptive external behaviors that get boys flagged in a classroom.
But beyond gender, there is this paradox regarding intelligence in the article, right?
Oh, it is one of the cruelest ironies in neurodevelopmental psychology.
Hmm.
You would intuitively think that having high academic ability and strong cognitive resources would equip someone to get help faster.
You would think so, yeah.
But higher intelligence is actually the ultimate cloaking device for neurodivergence. Higher cognitive ability is directly linked to stronger masking skills.
Oh, wow.
If you have a high IQ, you are incredibly adept at pattern recognition. So you observe the social rules, you compensate for your executive function struggles by creating these elaborate hidden workarounds, and you just blend in.
You become invisible.
Exactly. The students who are coping well on the surface, getting straight A's, and causing zero disruption, they are the ones flying completely under the radar.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because I have to play devil's advocate. If someone is smart enough and capable enough to compensate and get good grades or secure promotions, why does it even matter that they were missed? I mean, isn't their high intelligence effectively curing the outward problem?
Well, that assumption is exactly why the medical system ignored these adults for decades. Outward success is just an illusion that drains internal resources.
An illusion.
Yes. The behavioral output might look flawless, but the internal experience is one of constant, severe depletion. Masking is not a cure. It is a highly inefficient manual operation of cognitive systems. Over time, it leaves people profoundly exhausted and entirely disconnected from their true identities.
So they are just surviving, not thriving.
Exactly.
Which makes sense. I mean, if masking is a manual override burning through internal resources at an unsustainable rate, then logically the system has to crash eventually. You cannot redline an engine indefinitely.
The collapse is entirely inevitable, and the data shows this breakdown rarely happens in a vacuum. The systemic crash almost always coincides with major life transitions.
Like what kind of transition?
We're talking about the leap to university, a significant escalation in career responsibilities, or, very frequently, the transition into parenthood.
Because those transitions completely alter the environmental scaffolding.
Precisely. When you are a highly intelligent child in secondary school, the environment provides the structure for you.
Right, the bells ring, you go to class.
Yes. The schedule is rigid, expectations are clear, and the sensory input is somewhat predictable. But when you become a senior manager, or you bring a newborn home, the cognitive demands multiply exponentially.
Everything just blows up.
You suddenly have to independently manage unstructured time, navigate complex office politics, and process overwhelming sensory inputs with zero downtime. The environmental scaffolding vanishes.
And the sheer volume of demands simply outpaces their ability to compensate.
Yes, the processing power required to keep the mask up just isn't there anymore.
That structural collapse brings us to a really critical distinction from Dr. O'Reilly's article. When these individuals finally hit the wall, they often go to a doctor and get told they're experiencing burnout. But standard occupational burnout is not what is happening here, is it?
Not at all, and we have to firmly differentiate the two. Standard occupational burnout usually stems from a toxic workplace or chronic overwork. And crucially, it typically improves with rest, like a long vacation, or by changing jobs. But late diagnosed individuals experience specialized functional collapses. Let's look at autistic burnout first. This is a clinically distinct syndrome characterized by pervasive exhaustion, heightened sensory sensitivity, and a terrifying loss of previously held skills.
Wait, loss of skills, that has to be incredibly alarming.
Oh, it is.
Like suddenly being entirely unable to speak during a team meeting or finding the grocery store you've shopped at for 20 years suddenly too overwhelmingly bright and loud to even endure.
It is entirely destabilizing, and it's caused by a sustained, years-long mismatch between the world's expectations and the person's neurological capacity.
And then there's ADHD burnout, right?
Yes, a parallel but distinct phenomenon.
Yeah.
ADHD burnout is less of a steady decline and more of a cyclical depletion. It's this severe boom and bust cycle. You have periods of massive hyper-focus-driven output where the brain is flooded with adrenaline and you accomplish a month's worth of work in 3 days, followed by a massive, significant functional collapse.
It sounds like treating your car like it has a bottomless gas tank simply because you can occasionally drive 200 miles an hour in hyperfocus.
Yes.
But then you inevitably end up stranded on the side of the highway with zero fuel. The engine won't turn over, and you were sitting there wondering why since you were going so fast just a minute ago.
That is a perfect way to describe it. And when you are stranded on the side of that highway, the panic really sets in.
Yeah.
That panic shows up unequivocally in the clinical data, too. The psychological cost of this unacknowledged acknowledged struggle is immense.
The statistics are pretty grim, aren't they?
Very. Roughly 42% of autistic adults meet the criteria for a formal anxiety disorder and 37% for depressive disorder. And
Wow.
those rates just dwarf the general population.
Yeah.
For adults presenting with ADHD, over 50% have at least one co-occurring psychiatric condition.
Those numbers represent a staggering amount of invisible suffering. So, an adult in this situation goes to a medical professional. They are exhausted, their skills are regressing, the panic is setting in. The doctor looks at them, diagnoses the anxiety or the depression, and prescribes a standard treatment. Why doesn't that fix the problem?
Because they are treating the secondary reaction without ever understanding the primary neurodevelopmental catalyst.
Ah.
If a patient is profoundly depressed because their daily social interactions require a draining manual translation process, and they are severely anxious because their nervous system is constantly overwhelmed by their sensory environment, well, standard treatments are inadequate. Prescribing an SSRI without addressing the sensory overload or the masking only treats the symptom. It leaves the source completely untouched.
So treating the anxiety without treating the sensory overload is kind of like taking a handful of painkillers because you have a migraine, but refusing to turn off the blaring fire alarm right next to your ear. I mean, the medication might take the edge off, but the mechanism causing the pain is still actively assaulting your system.
A perfect mechanical analogy. And this failure of intervention extends far beyond just the doctor's office. It permeates the entire self-help, productivity, and professional development landscape.
Well, absolutely.
When these adults are visibly struggling to keep up with their peers, the standard societal advice focuses on building better habits, practicing self-discipline, and developing resilience.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Are you saying that when well-meaning friends or productivity gurus tell these adults to just use a planner or
Yeah.
push through it, they aren't just being unhelpful. They're actively compounding harm by framing a neurological difference as a character flaw.
What's fascinating here is that, yes, that is exactly what is happening. You are applying a neurotypical solution to a neurodivergent brain. Standard resilience frameworks are built entirely on a neurotypical baseline. Executive function, which governs planning, time management, task initiation, emotional regulation in ADHD and autism. Difficulties in these areas are neurobiological differences. They are not motivational deficits. ADHD, for instance, is fundamentally a disorder of self-regulation, not just attention. It's rooted in how the brain processes dopamine.
Okay, let's translate that dopaminergic difference for the listener. What does that actually look like in practice?
Think of dopamine as the clutch in a manual transmission vehicle.
Okay.
The clutch allows you to seamlessly shift gears between tasks, direct your attention to what is important, and initiate action. In an ADHD brain, the clutch is sticky. It doesn't engage smoothly.
So you're just grinding the gears.
Yes, no matter how badly the driver wants to shift gears, no matter how much willpower they exert, or how nicely their new color-coded planner tells them to shift into third gear, the mechanical transmission of dopamine just isn't cooperating.
Wow. So those conventional interventions implicitly message that the individual is inadequate.
Exactly. It tells them, this system works for everyone else. If it's not working for you, you simply aren't trying hard enough. And that messaging fundamentally worsens the chronic shame associated with a late diagnosis.
So if a planner is toxic advice and treating just the anxiety is only half the picture, what is the actual roadmap out of this? What does proper evidence-based identification look like in adulthood? Because, the internet makes it seem like getting diagnosed is just filling out a 15-question online quiz about how often you lose your keys.
Right, the TikTok effect. But the clinical reality of a true assessment is far more rigorous than a brief screening questionnaire. It involves taking a detailed developmental history, structured clinical interviews, and using validated instruments.
And the article mentions some specific gold standard tools, right? Like the ADOS 2 or Diva 2.0. What are those actually doing in the room?
They're looking for the mechanics beneath the mask. For autism, clinicians might use the ADOS 2, which is an observational measure, or the ADIR, or the 3DI. Instead of just asking how you feel, the clinician observes how you interact in real time. For ADHD, tools like the Diva 2.0 provide a highly structured interview format that maps current symptoms and childhood history against objective criteria.
But the goal of going through this rigorous process isn't just to hand the patient a diagnostic label and wave goodbye, is it?
No, not at all. The real output is a clinical formulation.
A clinical formulation.
Yes, it is a coherent account of how a person's specific neurological profile interacts with their history and their environment. And that formulation is the foundation for effective post-diagnostic support.
What does that support actually look like?
It requires specific adaptations, environmental design to reduce cognitive load, compassion-focused therapy to target that chronic shame we discussed, and for ADHD, carefully monitored medication for those underlying dopaminergic differences.
So, what does this all mean for the listener? If someone goes through this intense, destabilizing process of unlearning their entire masked identity, what is the payoff? Does the research actually show life gets better?
Yes, the empirical evidence is highly encouraging. Research shows late diagnosis leads to meaningful improvements in self-understanding, mental health, and overall quality of life, provided they have the right post-diagnostic support. They stop blaming themselves and start integrating this new identity into their sense of self.
That is just a fundamental reframing of the entire human experience. I mean, the struggle for these millions of adults has always been neurological, not moral. An accurate diagnosis completely changes the frame from shame to understanding, whether you are neurodivergent yourself, or managing, working with, or loving someone who is. This knowledge fundamentally changes how we view effort and burnout in our daily lives.
It really does. And if I can leave the listener with a final unaddressed question to mull over.
Please do.
If an ADHD or autism diagnosis requires us to completely redesign an individual's environment to reduce unnecessary cognitive load so they can thrive, it forces us to wonder, how many of our modern workplaces and educational systems are just universally poorly designed?
Oh, wow.
If we built environments that actually accommodated neurodivergent minds from day one, would literally everyone experience less burnout?
Now that is a provocative thought, Sleevon. If the societal operating system was built to handle a much wider variety of cognitive software, maybe none of us would crash quite so often. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the defaults, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next one.